The Cleveland Browns just made the most unpopular decision in the entire NFL, and the worst part? Everyone saw it coming. After months of promising fans, media, and the entire league that Shadair Sanders would have a fair and equal shot at the starting quarterback position, Cleveland did exactly what the insiders predicted they would do all along. They handed the job to Deshaun Watson. Not because the numbers backed it up, not because the tape justified it, and definitely not because the fan base wanted it. They did it because this was always the plan. And now, the receipts are everywhere. Let's rewind for a second, because this story doesn't start on Monday morning when the announcement leaked. It doesn't even start during preseason. This story starts months ago, before a single snap was taken in training camp, when the language coming out of Cleveland's front office already told you everything you needed to know. Back before OTAs and minicamp had even kicked off, Browns Executive Vice President J.W. Johnson was on record discussing Watson as the quarterback the team was building its offensive structure around. Think about that for a moment. That's not how you talk about a position that's supposedly wide open. That's not the language of a franchise walking into a genuine evaluation with no favorites. That's the language of an organization that already had a preferred outcome and just needed the on-field process to catch up with what they'd already decided behind closed doors. And yet, for the entire spring and summer, the public message never changed. Head coach Todd Monken, in his first year leading the team after Kevin Stefanski was fired in January, kept telling reporters that this was an open competition. He said Sanders and Watson would split first-team reps. He said both guys were starting-caliber quarterbacks. He said nothing would be decided until the full body of work had been evaluated. On the surface, that sounded reasonable. It sounded fair. But the deeper you looked at the details, the more the cracks in that narrative started to show. And what happened behind the scenes would leave a lot of people feeling deceived. Former NFL offensive lineman Jeff Schwartz is someone who makes a living dissecting exactly these kinds of situations. He's been watching the Browns' training camp closely, and what he observed on the practice field didn't match the story Cleveland was selling. According to Schwartz, even as Sanders was being scheduled to start the preseason game against Buffalo, Watson was still taking the majority of the meaningful reps. During the joint practice session with the Bills on August 20th, Watson led the first-team offense against Buffalo's starting defense. He received 6 reps in 11-11 drills. Sanders got 4. Now, you might hear that and think, okay, that's close to even. But context matters here. Joint practices are not ordinary practice sessions. NFL coaching staffs across the league have repeatedly said that joint practices are more valuable evaluation tools than preseason games themselves. The pace is faster, the physicality is real. You're going up against an unfamiliar opponent running their actual schemes. It's the closest thing to a regular season snap that exists in August. So when Cleveland decided to structure that specific practice around Watson, rather than the quarterback who was about to start the actual game 2 days later, Schwartz didn't hesitate to call it what it was, a double standard. And he wasn't the only one saying it. Schwartz laid it out plainly. He said one guy is getting the start on Saturday, but the organization is clearly showing signs that they want the other guy to win the job. He acknowledged that Sanders could still play well enough to force their hand, but the setup around Watson, the reps, the scripting, the priority given during the most crucial preparation moment of the week, all pointed in one direction. According to Schwartz, the Browns had already shown the league where this was heading at quarterback, even if they hadn't said it out loud yet. And for a 5th-round pick like Sanders, trying to earn a full-time starting role, that kind of uphill battle is nearly impossible to win when the deck is stacked before you even take the field. But the receipts didn't stop with practice reps, and the next layer of this story made the whole thing look even worse. Danny Parkins took things a step further. He argued that what Cleveland was doing wasn't just a competitive lean toward Watson, it was theater. According to Parkins, allowing Sanders to start the preseason game against Buffalo was essentially a ceremonial gesture. It gave the organization the ability to point at a list of opportunities Sanders had been given, while Watson continued to receive the lion's share of preparation, joint practice reps, and priority snaps. Behind the scenes, they could say Sanders got his shot.
In reality, the infrastructure around that shot was never built to support him.
Harkins also challenged something that a lot of people in the media had been running with, the idea that Watson had clearly separated himself in this competition. He pointed to Sanders' completion numbers during training camp settings and argued that when you looked at practice session production separately, Sanders had actually been outperforming Watson in certain areas. The interception numbers that people kept throwing around about Sanders' camp weren't being weighed against the full picture, and the notion that Watson had distinctly set himself apart simply wasn't supported by the data if you were evaluating this based on actual on-field production. But here's where it gets really interesting. Despite all of that, the reps kept leaning in Watson's direction, and when you combine the practice structure, the joint session priorities, and J.W. Johnson's pre-camp comments about building the offense around Watson, a pattern emerges that's hard to ignore. These weren't isolated decisions, they were pieces of a larger puzzle, and the picture that puzzle was forming didn't look anything like the open competition Cleveland had been advertising. The analysts weren't the only ones noticing. Local media coverage throughout the spring and summer had a noticeable tilt as well. Multiple observers pointed out that even during periods when Sanders was performing well in team drills, the coverage consistently found ways to frame things in Watson's favor. When Watson had a rough day, the narrative focused on context and recovery. When Sanders had a similarly rough day, the conversation shifted to whether he belonged on the field at all. That kind of consistent framing doesn't happen by accident, and when it aligns so closely with what the front office was already communicating privately, it starts to look less like objective reporting and more like message management. And the moment that confirmed everyone's suspicions was just around the corner. Saturday, August 22nd, Huntington Bank Field, the Browns hosting the Buffalo Bills in their second preseason game. This was supposed to be Sanders' moment, his chance to start, to play the first half, to show what he could do in a real game setting against a real opposing defense. And honestly, he delivered. Sanders went 9 for 11, threw for 74 yards and a touchdown with 1 interception. It wasn't a perfect outing, but for a second-year quarterback working with a partially reshuffled roster, it was efficient, it was decisive, and it was noticeably better than what came after. Watson entered the game in the second half, and from the moment he stepped onto the field, the boos started. Not from a packed stadium. The seats at Huntington Bank Field were only about half full, but the fans who were there made their feelings unmistakable. And the performance that followed didn't do Watson any favors. He completed just 5 of 12 passes for 36 yards and threw an interception across 4 drives. The offense went nowhere, the energy was flat, and the boos got louder. What happened after the game, though, is what turned a bad afternoon into a full-blown firestorm. Watson stepped up to the podium and didn't hold back. He told reporters that the booing had nothing to do with his performance. He said it was personal. He called it disrespectful. He referenced the last time he played at Huntington Bank Field, October 2024, when he tore his Achilles against the Bengals, and reminded everyone that some fans in the building that day had cheered when he went down. He said he gets more love on the road than he does at home, and then he dropped a line that went instantly viral. He said if they made him the starter, maybe he'd just treat every game like an away game. Maybe it's 17 away games then, he told reporters. The implication was clear. Watson felt unwanted in his own building, and instead of taking accountability for a rough outing in a preseason game, he pointed the finger back at the fans. The reaction from the rest of the league was immediate. Former players, current analysts, podcast hosts, social media, everybody had something to say, and almost none of it was in Watson's favor. Multiple former quarterbacks came out publicly and said, if you don't want to get booed, play better. Others pointed out the elephant in the room that Watson seemed to be referencing without directly naming, the over 20 dozen accusations of misconduct involving massage therapists that had followed him since 2021, the 11-game suspension, the settlements, and the massive contract that Cleveland gave him in the middle of all of it. Reports suggest Watson was implying the boos were rooted in those off-field issues rather than anything happening on the field, and while that's a conversation with layers, the timing and context of his comments didn't earn him much sympathy.
What did earn some attention, though, was what Sanders said after the game. Despite being in direct competition with Watson for the starting job, Sanders defended his teammate. He told reporters he didn't appreciate the booing and that regardless of the competition, they're all human beings out there trying to serve the franchise. He called it a matter of respect. That response stood out, not just because it was mature for a 24-year-old in only his second NFL season, but because it showed a level of leadership and locker room awareness that insiders had already been noticing behind the scenes. And none of it mattered, because 48 hours later, the Browns made their decision anyway. On Monday morning, August 24th, multiple reports confirmed what the signals had been pointing toward all along. Deshaun Watson was named the Cleveland Browns starting quarterback for Week 1 of the 2026 season. The Browns will open against the Jacksonville Jaguars on September 13th, and Watson will be under center. Todd Monken addressed the decision in a press conference, saying he had taken the full body of work into account, from the offseason program to training camp to the joint practice to both preseason games. He said he felt Watson gave them the best chance to move the ball and score points. He added that the decision was not going to be a week-to-week situation, suggesting they were committed to Watson beyond just the opener. He also said he had been leaning that direction even before the Bills game, but wanted to see one more evaluation window before making it official. And look, on paper, a coaching staff is within its rights to choose whichever quarterback it believes gives the team the best chance. That's how these competitions are supposed to work. But here's where the credibility problem kicks in. Because when you look at the numbers, the actual measurable production from these two preseason games, the case for Watson being the clear winner doesn't hold up. Sanders completed 68% of his passes across both games. Watson completed just under 60%. Sanders threw for a touchdown. Watson didn't throw a single one. Sanders earned a 72.3 PFF passing grade. Watson came in at 59.1, more than 13 grading points lower. Under pressure, Sanders posted a 60.3 PFF grade compared to Watson's 44.7. From a clean pocket, Sanders held the advantage again. The only stat that leaned in Watson's direction was total yardage, 162 to 153, a 9-yard difference that doesn't move the needle in any meaningful way. And Watson logged 2 turnover-worthy plays compared to Sanders' 1, with 0 big-time throws to Sanders' 1. So if you're evaluating this competition purely on what happened between the lines during the preseason, the numbers say Sanders was the better quarterback. Not by a mile, but clearly and consistently across multiple metrics. And that forces a question the Browns haven't been willing to answer directly. If the decision wasn't based on preseason production, what was it based on? That's where the money comes in. And this part of the story might be the most important piece of all. To understand why Cleveland is doing what they're doing, you have to understand the financial prison they built for themselves 4 years ago. In March 2022, the Browns traded 3 first-round picks, a third-round pick, and a fourth-round pick to the Houston Texans for Deshaun Watson, and then they gave him a fully guaranteed 5-year contract worth $230 million. At the time, it was the largest fully guaranteed deal in NFL history. It was a move that stunned the league, not just because of the money, but because of the circumstances. Watson had sat out the entire 2021 season. He was facing more than 22 civil lawsuits alleging misconduct. 2 grand juries in Texas had declined to indict him, but the cloud over his reputation was enormous. Cleveland looked past all of it. They paid the price. They made the bet. And it has been a catastrophe from virtually every angle. Since arriving in Cleveland, Watson has played just 19 games. He went 9-10 as a starter. His career QBR with the Browns sits at 33.1, which ranks among the lowest for any starting quarterback over that span. He's dealt with an 11-game suspension in 2022, a shoulder injury that limited him in 2023 and ended his 2024 season prematurely, and then the devastating Achilles tear in October 2024 that knocked him out for the rest of that year. During rehab, he re-tore the same Achilles, which wiped out the entire 2025 season as well. That means the man they paid $230 million to be their franchise quarterback has missed more games than he's played in a Browns uniform, and it's not close.
Browns owner Jimmy Haslam publicly acknowledged the failure at the annual league meeting in March 2025.
He called the Watson trade a big swing and miss and said the organization needed to dig itself out of the hole they'd created. That's the owner of the team, on the record, admitting that this was a disaster. And yet, here we are in August 2026, and Watson is being named the starter. Why? Because cutting him isn't financially viable. Releasing Watson now would trigger a record $127 million dead salary cap charge. Even waiting until next offseason and using a post-June 1 designation would still leave the Browns eating roughly $86 million in dead money, split across 2 cap years. Watson's contract has become an anchor around the franchise's neck, and the only way to justify that anchor is to keep playing the guy, even if the on-field evidence says someone else gives you a better shot. That's not a football decision, that's a financial one, and the people paying for it, with their ticket money, their emotional investments, and their loyalty, are the fans who have been telling the organization for years that they've seen enough. But this story has another angle that makes it even more complicated, and it involves what's waiting in the wings. Shedeur Sanders didn't arrive in Cleveland under ideal circumstances. He was a 5th-round pick in the 2025 draft, taken 152nd overall, after a polarizing college career at Colorado under his father, Deshaun Sanders. The draft day slide was significant. Sanders and Cam Ward had been discussed as the top 2 quarterbacks in the 2025 class for months, but while Ward went 1st overall to Tennessee, Sanders fell all the way to the 5th round. Some teams had concerns about his arm strength, others questioned his decision-making under pressure, and there was always the noise surrounding his father's larger-than-life presence, which some front offices viewed as a potential distraction. But Sanders came to Cleveland with something to prove, and from day one, he went to work. During his rookie season in 2025, the Browns cycled through quarterbacks like a revolving door. Joe Flacco won the initial competition and opened the season as the starter, but was eventually traded to Cincinnati mid-season. Dillon Gabriel, the 3rd-round pick, got his shot, but suffered an injury that opened the door for Sanders. By the final stretch of the season, Sanders had claimed the starting role. In 8 games, he threw 7 touchdowns and 10 interceptions. The numbers weren't flashy. His overall PFF grade as a rookie was 44.1, ranking near the bottom among qualifying quarterbacks. But there were flashes. The deep ball accuracy, the ability to throw across the middle, the poise in the pocket that had made him a top prospect coming out of high school and through his college career. What happened next is where the narrative shifts. Instead of heading home for the offseason or chasing endorsement opportunities, Sanders stayed in Cleveland. He spent most of the winter and spring working out at the Browns facility, studying film and building chemistry with his receivers. Coaches noticed. Offensive coordinator Travis Switzer said Sanders' progress had been impressive, specifically highlighting his footwork improvements and his ability to move through progressions faster. Todd Monken declared after minicamp that he had 2 starting-caliber quarterbacks, which at the time felt like a genuine acknowledgement that Sanders had closed the gap. And then came the moment that really turned heads inside the building. ESPN's Jeremy Fowler reported that when he talked to people within the Browns organization, the words that kept coming up about Sanders were presence and aura. Fowler said Sanders had something intangible that had strengthened his case, something beyond the stats and the practice reps. After the Bills' preseason game, Fowler went on the record saying that Sanders had made a compelling case at the very least. That's not the kind of language insiders use about a guy who's getting blown out in a competition. That's the language they use about a guy who's earning respect despite the system working against him. And yet, when Monday morning came, none of it was enough. Watson got the nod, Sanders got the backup role, and the question that's lingering over every conversation in Cleveland right now is simple. What exactly does Shedeur Sanders have to do to get a real shot? The answer to that question might not come this season, but the implications of it extend far beyond 2026. Here's where the chessboard gets really interesting. The Browns aren't just making a decision about Week 1 when they name Watson the starter. They're making a statement about the next 2 years of the franchise, and the math behind that statement should terrify the Cleveland front office. Watson is entering the final year of his contract. After this season, the Browns can move on with him with a post-June cut that splits the dead cap hit across 2 years. That means 2026 is essentially an audition, not for Watson to prove he's the long-term answer, because virtually nobody believes that anymore. It's an audition for Cleveland to justify the final year of this deal, without it being a complete waste. If Watson plays reasonably well and the Browns win a few games, they can say the decision was defensible, even if the team doesn't make the playoffs. If Watson falls apart, and given his injury history and diminished play, that's a very real possibility, then the leash gets short fast. And who's standing right behind him? Sanders, the guy who outplayed him in the preseason, the guy who earned praise from coaches and insiders all offseason, the guy with the presence and the aura that people inside the building keep talking about. If Watson stumbles in the first few weeks, the pressure to make a switch will be enormous. Monken said this won't be a week-to-week decision, but coaches say that until they can't say it anymore. 1 or 2 poor performances and the conversation changes overnight. But there's an even bigger factor looming over everything: the 2027 NFL Draft. The Browns currently hold 2 first-round picks next April, thanks to the Myles Garrett trade, and the 2027 quarterback class is being talked about as one of the strongest in years. Names like Garrett Nussmeier, Drew Aller, and other top prospects are already generating buzz as potential franchise-changing selections. If the Browns go through 2026 without getting a definitive answer at quarterback, and if Sanders doesn't take a massive leap, Cleveland could be in a position to draft a top-tier quarterback with one of those first-round picks. That's the real calculation happening behind the scenes. The Browns aren't just evaluating Watson versus Sanders, they're evaluating whether either of these guys is the long-term answer, or whether the real solution is sitting in a college stadium right now waiting to declare for the draft. And if that's the case, then the 2026 season becomes less about winning and more about information gathering. Play Watson until the wheels come off. If Sanders gets a chance and proves himself, great. If not, tank toward a top pick and use that ammunition in April 2027. It's a brutal way to run a franchise, but for the Browns, brutality has been the default setting for decades. And there's one more layer to this that nobody's talking about yet, but it might end up being the most important part of the whole story. The relationship between Deshaun Watson and the city of Cleveland is broken, and naming him the starter isn't going to fix it. It might actually make things worse. Think about what's coming. The Browns' first 2 games of the regular season are on the road, at Jacksonville on September 13th and at Tampa Bay the following week. Watson won't play in front of the home crowd until Week 3 against the Carolina Panthers. After what happened during the Bills' preseason game, the boos, the disrespectful comments, and the viral post-game presser, imagine what that Week 3 home opener is going to look like. If Watson is struggling, if the Browns drop both road games and come home 0-2, that stadium is going to be a hostile environment for its own quarterback. And Watson has already shown that the fan reaction affects him. He's already told the world that he feels more welcome on the road than he does at home. That's not a recipe for a functional quarterback-city relationship. That's a slow-motion divorce. And here's the part that makes all of this feel inevitable. Watson hasn't played a regular season game since October 2024. That's nearly 2 full calendar years away from real NFL action. He's coming off 2 Achilles surgeries. He's 30 years old. And even before the injuries, his play in Cleveland was never close to the level that earned him 3 Pro Bowl selections in Houston. His passer rating with the Browns has been 80.7. He's never thrown for 300 yards in a single game since arriving in Cleveland. The version of Deshaun Watson that the Cleveland traded for, the electric, dynamic, Pro Bowl quarterback, simply doesn't exist in this uniform, and betting on that version suddenly reappearing after 2 years away from the game is one of the most optimistic projections in recent NFL history. Meanwhile, Sanders is 24 years old, improving visibly, and has the kind of intangible leadership qualities that insiders keep noticing. He defended Watson publicly after the booing incident, showing maturity well beyond his experience level. He stayed in Cleveland all offseason when he could have been anywhere else. His coaches praise his work ethic, his teammates respect him, and his preseason numbers were objectively better than the guy who just got picked over him. If there was ever a situation where a young quarterback had earned the right to start, this feels like it. And yet, here we are.
The Browns have made their choice.
Whether it was driven by football evaluation, financial obligation, organizational politics, or a combination of all three, Watson is the guy for now. But the shelf life on this decision feels remarkably short. One bad game could change the conversation, two bad games could change the depth chart, and a full-scale collapse in the early weeks could change the trajectory of the entire franchise for years to come. So what's really happening in Cleveland right now? Is this a coaching staff that genuinely believes Watson gives them the best chance to win? Or is this a franchise so deeply committed to a $230 million mistake that they can't bring themselves to admit it's over? The answer probably falls somewhere in between. Monken is a first-year head coach, inheriting a mess he didn't create. The Watson contract isn't his fault, the roster construction isn't his fault, but the quarterback decision? That's on him. And how this plays out in the first 4 to 6 weeks of the season will define his tenure before it truly begins. For Sanders, the path forward is clear, even if it's painful. He has to stay ready. He has to keep improving. He has to be the guy they can't ignore when the opportunity comes back around. Because based on everything we've seen, that opportunity is coming sooner than Cleveland wants to admit. Whether it arrives in week 4 or week 8 or somewhere in between, the door will open again. And when it does, Sanders will either walk through it and cement himself as the future, or the Browns will be making phone calls about quarterbacks in the 2027 draft class. The national reaction to this decision has been overwhelming. Analysts from ESPN, NFL Network, PFF, and dozens of independent media voices have criticized the Browns for what many are calling a predetermined outcome disguised as a fair competition. The phrase, "rotten to its core," has been attached to the franchise. Former NFL quarterbacks have questioned the logic of choosing a diminished veteran coming off 2 years of inactivity over a young, improving player who outperformed him in every measurable preseason category. And Browns fans, the same fans who've endured decades of heartbreak, front office dysfunction, and quarterback mismanagement, are being asked once again to trust a process that appears designed to protect a sunk cost rather than build toward a future. Here's the thing about the NFL, though. Plans get disrupted. Narratives get rewritten. The league has a way of humbling organizations that think they've got everything figured out. If Watson comes out and plays at a high level, this becomes a non-story. The Browns look smart, Monken looks decisive, and the fan anger fades. But if Watson looks anything like the quarterback who's posted a 33.1 QBR across his Cleveland career, if the Achilles doesn't hold up, if the arm isn't where it needs to be, if the boos get into his head, then this decision becomes the defining failure of the Browns' 2026 season before it even gets going. Sanders has shown patience, he's shown maturity, he's shown growth, and whether Cleveland wants to acknowledge it publicly or not, he's shown that he belongs in the conversation. The next few weeks will reveal whether any of that matters to the people making the decisions, or whether the only thing that matters in Cleveland is the $230 million name on the contract. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the Browns made the right call, or did Shedeur Sanders get robbed of a job he earned on the field? This story is far from over, and the first real test is coming fast. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because the moment something changes in Cleveland's quarterback situation, you'll want to hear about it first. The regular season is 3 weeks away, and every snap Watson takes will be under a microscope, unlike anything we've seen in this league in years. Cleveland made their choice. Now the football has to back it up, and if it doesn't, the fallout is going to be massive.